The call log described it as a Priority 3 organic matter blockage in a primary nutrient conduit. Just another day at the office. My boots squelched on the corridor floor, a perma-damp composite of recycled polymers and cloned cartilage that was supposed to self-repair. In reality, it just sweated. The whole building, the Arco 7 bio-tenement, smelled of mold, ozone, and something vaguely like butchery. These bio-builds were all the rage 20 years ago, living, breathing architecture for a city choking on its own steel dust. Now, they were just vertical slums, sagging under the weight of their own biological decay. To me, it was just plumbing. More complex, sure, but in the end, everything was just a pipe and a pressure problem. "Almost there, Al." Kaya's voice crackled in my earcom. "Floor 112, sub-level B, nutrient line Delta." "Copy that, base," I muttered, rounding a corner. The service tunnels weren't built for human comfort. They were the building's vascular system, and I was just a microbe floating through. The walls around me were a fleshy, purple gray, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. Faint capillaries webbed the surface, glowing with the pale green of nutrient fluid. It was supposed to be a marvel of bioengineering. To me, it felt like working in an old man's throat. I found the conduit in question, a thick, arterial pipe that bulged unnaturally. Its surface was stretched taut and was a feverish, mottled red compared to the healthy tissue around it. Classic pressure buildup, I thought, my mind already running through the procedure. I dropped my heavy toolkit with a meaty thud. The air was thick here, heavy with a smell like rotten fruit and hot metal. I ran a gloved hand over the distended pipe. It was hot to the touch, and I could feel a faint, high-frequency vibration through the synthetic leather of my glove. Odd. Usually, these things just go inert. "Kaya, getting some strange readings here. Feels active." "Specs show it's just a standard calcification of waste protein, Al. Nothing exotic. Get your saw, cut a pressure release vent, and flush it with the catalytic agent. Standard procedure." Standard procedure. The words were a comfort, a mantra in the gut of this rotting beast. I trusted the procedure. I pulled the RS-80 high-pressure saw from my kit. It was a heavy, ugly tool designed to slice through bone-grafted plating and mineral deposits like a hot knife through butter. I braced my feet on the slick floor, lined up the saw's monomolecular blade with the most swollen part of the conduit, and squeezed the trigger. The whine of the saw was instantly deafening in the enclosed space. It bit into the pipe's fleshy wall, and resistance was minimal. Easier than I thought. A thin mist of vapor hissed from the incision, smelling sharp and coppery. Then, just as the blade sunk to its full depth, it happened. It wasn't a mechanical failure or a structural collapse. It was a scream. Not through the air, but through the building itself. A shriek of pure, unadulterated agony vibrated up through the floor, through my boots, and into the marrow of my bones. It was a sound that had no right to exist, a physical wave of torment that made the lights flicker and my teeth ache. I stumbled back, dropping the saw. In the same instant, the pipe erupted. Not with sludge or grime, but with a torrent of hot, dark fluid that steamed as it hit the air. It wasn't green nutrient solution. It was red. A deep, arterial red, thick with clotting agents and shimmering with biological light. It sprayed across my chest, soaking my overalls, searingly hot. The copper smell was overwhelming, the unmistakable iron tang of blood. My blood? Someone else's blood. I knew it intimately from a dozen workplace accidents. This was the same, but impossibly more. The lifeblood of something titanic. The corridor was empty. The bulge suddenly became more visible. The building's scream faded, leaving behind a ringing silence and the steady, wet patter of the crimson fluid dripping from the ceiling. My heart was a trip hammer against my ribs. The stuff was all over me, hot and sticky, its metallic stench clinging to the inside of my helmet. I stared at my work, my mind struggling to process what my senses were screaming at me. Where my saw had cut, the conduit was gaping open. It wasn't a pipe, not really. It was an artery. And the blockage? Dear God, the blockage! It was a pulsating, tumorous mass of raw tissue, a chaotic knot of angry red muscle and glistening yellow fat, webbed with throbbing veins. It looked like a cancerous growth, a hideous malformation deep in the building's flesh, and I had just stabbed it in the heart. As I watched, the wound I'd inflicted began to slowly, sluggishly try to knit itself back together, pale fibers reaching across the gash like clumsy sutures. My professional detachment, the mental armor I wore to every job, cracked. This wasn't a plumbing problem anymore. This was a veterinarian's nightmare. Kaya, do you read me? I barked into my comm, my voice tight. We have a code black situation, unclassified biological. The conduit is living tissue. Repeat, the blockage is a neoplasm. I'm scrubbing the job, getting out of here now. Only static hissed back. I cursed and slapped the side of my helmet. The building's dense organic matter must be interfering. No matter. Protocol was clear. Identify a biohazard, vacate the immediate area, and report for decontamination. Job over. Someone with a much bigger paycheck could deal with this mess. My only priority was getting out. I grabbed my toolkit, ignoring the fallen saw that was still slick with the structure's blood, and turned back the way I came. The service tunnel stretched before me, its rhythmic pulsing now feeling less like a gentle breath and more like the agitated contractions of a wounded animal. I stomped through puddles of the dark fluid, my boots making obscene sucking sounds. Just get back to the access hatch. Get out. The hatch was maybe 30 meters away. I'd propped it open when I came in, a heavy disc of reinforced chitin that opened and closed with an iris-like sphincter mechanism, standard for these bio-builds. But it wasn't open anymore. I slowed, my stomach twisting into a cold knot. The circular opening was gone. In its place was a solid wall of puckered, clenched tissue. It looked like a scar, the muscle fibers visibly knotted together in a tight, impenetrable seal. I broke into a run, skidding to a halt before it. I pushed against it. It was like shoving against a mountain of solid muscle. It was warm, tense, and utterly unyielding. No, 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 I muttered, my breath fogging the inside of my faceplate. I hammered on it with my fist, the impact making a dull, meaty thud. Nothing. The building had sealed the wound. I was inside the wound. A horrible realization began to dawn. The building wasn't just a structure. It was an organism. And I had hurt it. Now it was closing itself off, isolating the injury. Isolating me. I looked around frantically. The tunnel was a dead end. I was sealed in. The low, steady pulse of the walls seemed to mock me, a slow and patient heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. The air suddenly felt warmer, heavier. I was no longer a plumber in a service corridor. I was a foreign object, a sliver of glass lodged deep in the flesh of something vast and very, very alive. And it was just beginning to notice I was here. The initial shock congealed into a cold, sharp-edged panic. It clawed at my throat, threatening to choke me. I fought it down. Panicking doesn't fix a busted pipe, and it sure as hell wouldn't get me out of a sealed-up living building. I was a professional. This was a system, and every system had an alternate route, a pressure release valve, a maintenance bypass. I just had to find it. I left the clenched sphincter of the main hatch behind and moved deeper into the vascular network, my mag torch cutting a sharp white cone through the humid darkness. Every few meters, a rectangular grate was set into the fleshy wall or floor. Access to secondary conduits, wiring bundles, waste filtration. My boots sloshed through the cooling pools of the building's blood as I ran to the first one. I jammed my pry bar into the seam and heaved. The metal groaned, but the grate didn't budge. Leaning closer, I saw why. A thick, pearlescent membrane had been secreted around the edges, gluing the grate to its frame. It was like a new layer of skin, slick and glistening under my light, sealing the opening completely. It was fresh. It hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. A knot of dread tightened in my gut. I stumbled to the next grate, and the next. All of them were the same, sealed tight with the same hastily produced organic sealant. It was as if the building was producing scar tissue in real time, locking everything down, every potential opening scabbed over with new growth. I pounded on one with the heavy end of my pry bar, the impacts echoing wetly down the tunnel, but the membrane simply absorbed the force, rippling like tough rubber. It was useless. My comm crackled with static, a dead hiss that offered no hope. Kaya, can anyone read me? I'm trapped in sub-level B, conduit Delta 7. Does anyone copy? Silence. The sheer mass of living tissue was swallowing my signal whole. No signal, no exit. I slumped against a wall, the clammy, yielding surface pressing back against my shoulder blades. The rhythmic pulse of the structure was faster now, a low, persistent thrum I could feel vibrating in my chest. Thump, 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 thump. An anxious heartbeat. The air was growing thick, saturated with humidity and the coppery stench of its spilled lifeblood. It was getting harder to breathe, each inhale feeling like I was drinking the air rather than breathing it. My suit's environmental controls kicked in, the faint whir of the scrubbers a lonely sound in the oppressive silence. I looked down the tunnel. The soft, green glow of the capillary network seemed brighter, the nutrient fluid pulsing through with more urgency. It was a closed loop, a living circulatory system, and I was trapped in its veins. My pragmatic mind, the one that saw systems and solutions, was failing me. This wasn't a mechanical failure I could bypass or a busted valve I could replace. This was a biological reaction. I wasn't dealing with a malfunctioning machine. I was dealing with an immune response. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The scream, the bleeding, the sealed hatches, the new membranes. It was all part of a single, coordinated process. The building wasn't just broken, it was wounded. And right now, its body was doing everything it could to isolate the trauma and deal with the contamination. The contamination was me. My training kicked in, a lifeline of cold logic in a rising sea of existential dread. Brute force was getting me nowhere. Pounding on the walls of my prison was as useless as a fly buzzing against a window pane. If I wanted to find a weakness, I needed to understand the system. I needed data. My mind raced, replaying my path from the main access corridor. About 50 meters back from the wound I'd inflicted, I'd passed a maintenance node. A small, recessed terminal embedded in the fleshy wall, its screen dark. It was the building's equivalent of a nerve ganglion, a diagnostic port for technicians. If there was a schematic, a failsafe, an override for the lockdown, it would be in there. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. I started moving, my steps urgent. The tunnel seemed tighter than before. The steady pulsing of the walls had become a slow, powerful peristalsis, the corridor rhythmically constricting and relaxing around me. It was like walking through a massive intestine. I had to time my movements, scrambling forward during the wider phase of the pulse and bracing myself as the walls squeezed in, the fleshy surfaces pressing against my shoulders. The building was moving, trying to push things through its system. Was it trying to expel me, or just circulating its fluids, ignorant of my presence? Finally, I saw it. The faint, rectangular outline of the maintenance node. I wiped a smear of grime and condensation from the screen and pressed my palm against it. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft chime, the screen flickered to life, bathing the corridor in a cold blue light. The interface was standard Gen Bio Architecture OS, familiar territory. I keyed in my technician's access code, AL-734, and the system recognized me instantly. Technician AL-734 logged in. Accessing system diagnostics. A cascade of text scrolled past. Pressure readings, nutrient flow rates, atmospheric composition. It was a torrent of data, the vital signs of a patient in critical condition. Alarms were flashing everywhere. Critical tissue damage, Sector 112-Delta-7. Systemic pressure loss detected. Initiating emergency wound cauterization protocol. So that's what the sealed hatches were. Cauterization. A biological lockdown. My fingers flew across the touchscreen, navigating the sub-menus. I was looking for environmental controls, access overrides, anything that looked like a door. Instead, I found a log file labeled Immunological Response. My blood ran cold. I opened it. The screen refreshed with a new set of terrifyingly clinical data. Foreign biomass detected at trauma site. Sample analysis. Inorganic contaminants, metals, polymers, unknown xenoproteins. Threat assessment. Severe. Systemic immunological response triggered. Then I saw the final line of code. It was a simple reclassification, a single line of text that changed everything. My stomach plummeted, the last vestiges of my professional confidence dissolving into pure horror. It was a status update, time-stamped just moments after I'd cut into the pipe. My own designation within the system had been changed. Subject designation, Technician AL-734, Invasive pathogen. Class 1 threat. Pathogen protocol engaged. Lysosome directive activated. Invasive pathogen. The system didn't see me as a person anymore. My tools, my suit, my body. It was all just foreign matter. A virus, a disease to be eradicated. And lysosome directive. I vaguely remembered that from my bioarch training. It was the building's last line of defense. The system that released phagocytes, cellular janitors, microscopic hunter-killers designed to swarm, dissolve, and absorb anything that wasn't supposed to be there. As I stared at the screen, a new alert flashed at the bottom, pulsing in bright, urgent red. Warning. Phagocytic agents deployed to Sector 112, Delta 7. A faint, wet, scraping sound echoed from down the tunnel. It was coming from all around me. The silence in the aftermath of my discovery was profound. It felt different now, no longer merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something listening. I found myself holding my breath, straining my ears for any noise that didn't belong to the muckworm's dying systems. My belief in technology hadn't just been shaken, it had been shattered. Technology was a shield, and my shield was broken. Reason was a map, and my map showed a world that didn't exist. Now, stripped of both, I was left with only instinct, and every instinct was screaming. That's when I felt it. A low, rhythmic pulse vibrating through the hull. It wasn't the jagged shudder of a failing system or the groan of stressed metal. This was a deep, resonant thrum, 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 a methodical and unnervingly biological beat. It was the sound of a living machine, something vast and powerful, operating on a scale I couldn't comprehend. It was the slow, patient heartbeat of the abyss itself. My own heart leaped into my throat, hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against the calm, steady pulse from outside. I scrambled to the viewport, my hands pressed against the cold, cracked plasteel. The beam of my helmet lamp was swallowed by the ink, revealing nothing. The darkness remained absolute. But the darkness was no longer empty. The lights returned, not distant this time, but close, terribly close. A swirl of cold, blue-white pinpricks bloomed in the void directly in front of me, resolving out of the black. They weren't drifting randomly now. They were circling, a slow, predatory spiral. Fleeting glimpses of an impossible reality were caught in their ghostly glow. A patch of hide, not scaled like a fish, but plated like ancient, overlapping tiles of obsidian armor, each section the size of my submersible. The texture was wrong, pocked and scarred with geological time. Then another patch, this one showing a mountain range of strange calcified growths, an ecosystem of their own clinging to a living continent. The light swirled again, and for a gut-wrenching, world-ending second, I saw the eye. It was the size of the entire viewport. It wasn't a simple lens and pupil, but a complex, galactic swirl of bioluminescent filaments, a nebula of ancient perception. It regarded me with a cold, passionless intelligence that stripped me bare. There was no malice in it, no anger. There was only curiosity. The dispassionate, focused curiosity a scientist might have for a microbe trapped on a slide. In that moment, I understood with sickening, visceral certainty. This was not a random encounter. The initial impact wasn't an accident. The severed comms line wasn't a coincidence. I was a curiosity that had strayed too close. A shiny rock that had caught its attention. This primordial god of the crushing deep was intelligent. It was studying me. I wasn't just stranded. I wasn't just lost. I was being hunted. The sub shuddered as a gentle pressure, impossibly vast, nudged it. It was like being prodded by a mountain. The metallic groan of the muckworm's frame was the cry of a mouse in the jaws of a cat. The low, rhythmic heartbeat intensified, vibrating through my bones, seeming to sync with my own terrified pulse until I couldn't tell them apart. It was inside my head, its sheer presence overwhelming my senses. My meticulously ordered mind, my faith in procedure and predictable outcomes dissolved completely, replaced by a raw, primal terror that went beyond the fear of death. It was the fear of utter insignificance. A fear of being an object of study for a being whose thoughts were geological epics and whose awareness spanned an entire abyssal ecosystem. My life, my technology, my entire species, we were a footnote in its world, and it was about to turn the page. The voice was on the edge. My lungs burn. Every frantic gasp drew in the hot, cloying air of the arterial tunnels. The wet, shuffling pursuit of the phages was a constant, unnerving chorus behind me. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The corridor was a writhing river of white. They flowed over each other, a single-minded tide of organic sentinels, their milky bodies glowing faintly in the gloom. They weren't gaining on me, but they weren't stopping either. They would never stop. I followed the schematic in my head, a mental map I'd half memorized during my initial briefing. Coolant systems for a bio-build like this had to be isolated, cryo-sealed to protect the surrounding living tissue from freezing. That meant a separate chamber, reinforced walls, a dead end, but a defensible one. I saw the junction ahead, a heavy, sphincter-like valve similar to the one that had sealed me in, but this one was ribbed with cryo conduits frosted white with ice. My sanctuary. The valve was partially open, a testament to the building's feverish state and organized response. I threw my shoulder against the edge and squeezed through the narrow, icy opening just as the first few phages rounded the corner behind me. On the other side, I found the emergency lockdown lever, a thick, bony extrusion from the wall. I put all my weight on it, and with a deep, grinding groan of chilling flesh, the sphincter ground shut, its frozen edges meeting with a final, solid thud. Silence. The change in environment was instantaneous and absolute. The air was crisp, dry, and bitingly cold. My breath plumed in front of my faceplate in a thick white cloud. I had stumbled out of a humid jungle into a frozen tomb. I stood in a vast, cavernous chamber. The walls were the same fleshy material, but here they were frozen solid, a dark, bruised purple color, and sheened with a thick layer of rime. Great, thick pipes, the actual cooling conduits, crisscrossed the chamber. their metal surfaces weeping condensation that froze into delicate icicles. In the center of the room was a huge, semi-transparent cistern, the reservoir itself, filled with a sluggish, pale blue liquid that swirled with cryo-steam. The cold was biting, but to me it felt like clean, fresh air. The relentless pulsing of the building was gone here. The organic matter was inert, dormant. I pressed my hand against the frozen wall. It was like stone. The pores were sealed tight with ice. Nothing was getting through here. For the first time since cutting that pipe, I felt a flicker of hope. I was safe. My eyes scanned the chamber, taking in the details. It was a maintenance hub for the entire coolant system. Against the far wall sat a heavy-duty maintenance locker. With trembling hands, I worked the latch, my numb fingers clumsy. It swung open with a squeal of protest. Inside were spare parts, diagnostic tools, and jackpot, a high-powered chemical sprayer used for de-icing and applying antifungal agents. It was bigger than a standard-issue sprayer, with a heavy tank and a long, wicked-looking nozzle. A weapon. I lifted it, the weight of it a reassuring presence in my hands. The tank was 3/4 full of a corrosive-smelling viscous amber fluid. I didn't know what it would do to the phages, but it was better than nothing. I stood there, in the cold, echoing silence of the reservoir chamber, the sprayer held tight against my chest. The low temperature kept the walls inert and repelled the hunters. I had a weapon. I had a fortress. For the first time, in the frigid quiet, I allowed myself to believe that I might just make it out of this alive. The door opened. A moment of tension. A figure begins to emerge. Hope is a fragile thing. In the frozen heart of the coolant reservoir, it had felt solid, like the weapon in my hands. But I was inside a living system, a body that had identified me as a disease. And a body will do anything to fight a fever. It started subtly, a tremor in the floor, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. Then a low, guttural groaning from the walls. The frozen rime on the fleshy surfaces began to glisten, turning from white frost to a clear, wet sheen. I looked at the temperature gauge on my suit's HUD. The ambient reading was climbing. -10 degrees, -5, 0. The building was actively fighting the coolant, flooding the surrounding tissue with warmth, intentionally sacrificing its own temperature regulation to get to me. Then the walls began to sweat. A thick, clear mucus, like albumin, beaded on the purplish flesh before running down in thick, viscous streams. Where it pooled on the floor, it steamed, melting the ice. The building was heating the room from the outside in. The fortress was thawing. A wet, slapping sound from the cryo valve made me spin around. The thick, white bodies of the phages were pressed against the translucent inner membrane of the sealed sphincter. But they weren't just waiting. They were pushing, their protoplasmic forms flattening as they forced themselves into the melting seams. One pushed through, then another, dropping to the heated floor with a sizzle. My sanctuary was breached. "Stay back!" I yelled, the useless words swallowed by the vast chamber. I raised the chemical sprayer, my hands slick with sweat inside my gloves. The first few phages began their slow, inexorable crawl toward me. I pulled the trigger. A high-pressure jet of amber liquid shot from the nozzle, striking the lead phage dead on. The effect was immediate and horrific. The creature's gelatinous body convulsed violently, its surface bubbling and smoking as the corrosive chemicals broke down its cellular structure. In seconds, it dissolved into a foul-smelling gray sludge that hissed on the floor. It worked. A grim smile touched my lips. I swept the beam left and right, melting 2 more of the white hunters. They were no match for the de-icing agent. But for every one I dissolved, 3 more squeezed through the rapidly thawing valve. The room was heating up fast. The walls were now slick and glistening, the inert flesh becoming pliable and active again. Then the whole valve seemed to bulge inward. With a sound like tearing cartilage, the sphincter burst open. It wasn't just a few phages anymore. It was an army, and it was led by something new. Bursting through the tide of smaller creatures was a monster. It was a phagocyte, but one that was easily 10 times the size of the others, a great heaving mountain of undulating white protoplasm that filled half the entryway. It was a macrophage, a killer cell of terrifying proportions. Smaller phages flowed around its base like pilotfish around a shark. My hope turned to ash in my mouth. I aimed the sprayer at the massive creature and held down the trigger, dousing its colossal form in the corrosive spray. It shrieked, a high-pitched, sizzling sound of agony, and a huge portion of its body dissolved into smoking ooze. But it was too big. It recoiled, then surged forward, a tidal wave of living pus. I kept spraying, emptying the canister, but it only seemed to enrage it. Before the tank ran dry, the massive phage slammed into me, throwing me across the room. I hit the floor hard, the sprayer clattering from my grasp. As I scrambled to my feet, a new horror began. From grates in the floor that I hadn't even noticed, a thick, greenish-yellow liquid began to pour into the chamber. It smelled like bile and stomach acid. It sizzled where it touched the metal pipes, eating away at the surface. Digestive fluid. The chamber was flooding. My hope wasn't just extinguished. It was being actively, chemically dissolved. The acid rose quickly, pooling around my boots with a venomous hiss. I scrambled backwards, away from the encroaching yellow tide and the monstrous phage that was already reforming its wounded mass. The smaller ones were navigating the corrosive flood, their bodies seemingly immune to the digestive agents their own system was producing. They were closing in. My back hit the far wall of the chamber. I was cornered. The chemical sprayer was empty, its nozzle dripping the last few useless drops onto the floor. The acid was up to my shins now, and I could feel the outer layer of my reinforced boots starting to soften and bubble. It wouldn't be long before it ate through completely. Panic gave way to a chilling, absolute certainty. Escape was impossible. There was no way out. I was going to die here, dissolved into a chemical soup in the belly of this concrete and cartilage beast. I was a foreign body, an infection, and this was the end stage of the immune response. Stomach acid. My mind, feverish and adrenaline-soaked, latched onto that single obsessive thought. The building wasn't trying to kill me out of malice. It was just a body purging a disease. My presence, my tools, the very air I exhaled, it was all alien, a contamination that the system, in its blind biological imperative, had to neutralize and absorb. A strange, wild thought flickered in the ruin of my despair. It was insane, it was suicidal, but it was the only idea I had left. If the building was treating me like a disease, then I would act like one. Viruses don't try to escape the body. They don't run from the immune system. They go deeper. They replicate. They head for the vital organs. They aim for the heart, the brain, the central nervous system. They make the body sick from the inside out. My plan to get out had failed at every turn because I was thinking like a plumber, like a man. I had to start thinking like a pathogen. A ragged, desperate grin split my face, a rictus of pure, unadulterated madness. I was going to stop running. I was going to stop trying to escape. I was going to give this building exactly what it deserved. I was going to give it a fatal infection. My suit was already coated in the building's own caustic digestive fluids. The metal on my tools, the synthetic polymers of my pack, my own alien biology, all of it was toxic to this perfectly balanced internal ecosystem. I was a walking cocktail of contaminants. If I could just get to the building's core, its central processing unit, its heart or brain or whatever passed for one, maybe, just maybe, I could be the infection that brought the whole system crashing down. I looked at the heaving mass of the giant phage blocking the exit, then at the deepening pool of acid. There was no path through, but there was a path down. One of the grates, bubbling with digestive fluid, was larger than the others, a primary drainage conduit. It was a one-way trip to the building's guts. It was also my only remaining route. Embracing the horror, I took a deep, final breath of the chamber's semi-breathable air and waded into the corrosive tide. The acid surged up to my waist, the searing heat making me cry out as it began to devour the seals on my suit. With my last ounces of strength, I heaved the drainage grate open and, without a second thought, plunged into the churning, acidic darkness below. The plunge was a shock of nauseating thermal violence. I was immediately swallowed by a torrent of warm, viscous fluid, my world reduced to a maelstrom of darkness, pressure, and the searing agony of the digestive acid working its way into the seams of my suit. My helmet's external lamps shorted out with a fizz, plunging me into absolute blackness. I was blind, adrift in the guts of the Leviathan. For a terrifying minute, I tumbled end over end, disoriented, my lungs screaming for air I couldn't get. But I wasn't in a simple drain pipe. I had been flushed from the coolant chamber's digestive sump into one of the building's massive arterial passages. This was the circulatory system. The flow here was powerful, immense, a river of nutrient-rich plasma carrying me along like a piece of driftwood. The immediate acidic threat was diluted by the sheer volume of the building's blood, but my suit was compromised, the burning a constant, agonizing reminder of my borrowed time. I stopped fighting the current. That was the old way of thinking. Now I was a willing virus, a blood-borne pathogen hitching a ride. I curled into a ball, letting the powerful flow carry me, my new purpose a burning coal in my chest. Go deeper, find the core. Navigating in the suffocating darkness was a thing of instinct and sensation. I couldn't see, but I could feel. The thrumming of the building's heart, a distant, monolithic beat, grew steadily louder, a bass note that resonated in my bones, giving me a crude sense of direction. The walls of the aorta rushed past, slick and yielding. Occasionally, I'd bump into something soft and globular, oxygenating cells the size of beach balls, or be shoved aside by the powerful flex of a massive valve regulating the flow. This deep, the building's other defenses were more apparent. At one junction, a cluster of what felt like cilia, long, wavering tentacles, brushed against me, testing my chemical signature. I froze, playing dead, and the current thankfully pulled me past before they could get a firm grip. Later, I felt a change in pressure as a school of smaller, faster-moving organisms swam past me, patrol cells that ignored me in their haste to get somewhere else. I was just one more piece of debris in the lifeblood of the city-sized creature. My internal monologue had shifted from panic to a detached, feverish analysis. My suit was failing. The caustic fluid that had saturated me was now leaking in, and my skin felt like it was on fire. Pain was a constant, but it was also a tool. I was becoming the very thing the building feared, a vector. Every bit of me was poison. The great thrumming grew louder, the beat of the building's heart so powerful it felt less like a sound and more like the entire universe was contracting and expanding around me. Thump, 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 thump. It was close. The artery I was in began to branch, splitting into smaller and smaller vessels. I had to choose a path. I let the vibrations guide me, angling my body toward the direction where the thrumming was most intense. I was in the pulmonary system now, heading straight for the central pump, the source of all life in this monstrous structure. I was a blood clot aiming for the heart. The darkness didn't matter anymore. My destination was announcing itself with every beat. The voice turned from dust to blood, and the bones fleshed with grim purpose. The current slowed, the crushing pressure of the aorta easing as I was shunted into a space so vast that the flow of fluid became a gentle, swirling eddy. The thrumming was no longer a vibration in my bones. It was an overwhelming physical presence, a sound and pressure wave that pulsed through the very medium I floated in. My journey was over. I had arrived. My failing helmet lights flickered weakly, casting a fragmented, strobe-like view of my surroundings. I was floating in an immense cavern, a central chamber at the nexus of 1,000 arteries and veins. And in the center of it, suspended by thick umbilicals of woven nerve tissue and throbbing conduits, was the building's heart. It wasn't a heart of muscle and valves. It was a brain, a central neural cluster the size of a municipal transport, glistening with bioluminescence. Its surface was a convoluted mass of gray matter, glowing with soft, pulsing blue and violet light that traced the paths of thoughts, or whatever passed for thoughts in a living building. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly alien. This was the consciousness, the central command that had marked me for death. I was not alone. Patrolling the vast chamber were the guardians. 3 of the giant macrophage phagocytes, even larger than the one I'd encountered in the coolant reservoir, moved with a slow, ponderous grace. They were the royal guards, their massive white forms sweeping the chamber for any impurity, any foreign agent that might have slipped past the outer defenses. My time was short. My suit was breached in a dozen places. The cocktail of digestive fluid and the building's own plasma creating a toxic soup that was slowly pickling me alive. I had one tool left, one last act of professional vandalism. My pry bar, magnetically clamped to my leg, was still there. The closest guardian was sweeping its slow patrol near a massive nutrient vessel, a thick-walled conduit that fed a stream of rich, golden fluid directly into the neural core. An idea born of spite and agony formed in my dying mind. A diversion. I kicked off from a nearby wall, my movements clumsy and agonized, and propelled myself toward the nutrient line. The large phagocyte turned its eyeless mass toward me, sensing my alien motion. It was too slow to be a threat, but it was closing the distance. Ignoring the searing pain, I gripped the pry bar and slammed its pointed end against the conduit's main valve joint. Once. Twice. On the third strike, the joint fractured with a dull crack. Golden, protein-rich fluid geysered out into the chamber. It was pure, unfiltered sustenance, a siren's call to the phagocytes. As I'd hoped, all 3 guardians immediately abandoned their patrols and surged toward the leak, their biological imperative to clean and contain overriding their order to protect. Their huge bodies converged on the rupture, engulfing the cloud of nutrient fluid in a frenzy of absorption. That was my window. With the last of my strength, I launched myself through the open water, a dying missile aimed at the god brain. I flew past the distracted guards, my failing body a vector of pure contagion, my suit weeping the corrosive chemicals I'd gathered on my journey. I hit the central cluster with a wet, meaty impact. The surface was soft, like cold gelatin. I raised the pry bar high. It was no longer a tool for fixing things. It was a scalpel, a fang. I plunged it deep into the glistening gray matter. Then, with a final, hateful scream that was mostly just bubbling fluid, I wrenched it sideways, tearing open a massive, weeping gash in the mind of the building. The reaction was not a scream. It was a system-wide, catastrophic seizure. A wave of pure, white-hot electrical energy erupted from the core, flinging me backwards. Every light in the cavern blew out, plunging it into darkness. The great thrumming heartbeat stopped, and in the dead silence, the entire world began to tear itself apart. The building's death agony was a tectonic event. The silence after the seizure lasted only a second before the entire structure began to convulse. A violent, shuddering tremor threw me against the cavern wall, the impact cracking my faceplate and knocking the last of the air from my lungs. The umbilicals tethering the dead neural core snapped with sounds like cannon fire, and the great brain drifted listlessly in the dark, its internal lights extinguished forever. The system was crashing, and it was taking its physical form with it. The gentle circulation of the chamber turned into a violent, unpredictable vortex as massive valves failed and pressure seals blew out one by one throughout the tenement. I was caught in the maelstrom, a ragdoll in a dying god's circulatory system. The building was hemorrhaging internally, and I was being swept along in the chaotic flood. I was slammed through rupturing arteries, scraped against shattering bone supports, and pulled by currents of venting superheated steam. My suit was shredded, my body a ruin of burns, bruises, and broken bones. The pain was a distant, roaring fire. My consciousness was a flickering candle in a hurricane. I had no control, no direction. I was just part of the catastrophic failure I had initiated. There was a moment of immense, crushing pressure as the passage I was in constricted, not with a biological pulse, but with the grinding, splintering failure of the entire level's superstructure collapsing. Then, with an explosive roar, the outer wall gave way. Light. Blinding, agonizing daylight. After the eternal, bloody darkness of the building's innards, the mundane afternoon sun was a physical blow. I was weightless for a moment, a piece of shrapnel in a blast of crimson fluid, rent flesh, and shattered biopolymers. I saw a surreal snapshot of the city street below, startled pedestrians, screeching vehicles, before gravity reasserted its claim. I hit the pavement with a sickening, final crunch. I was lying in a puddle of the building's lifeblood on the cold, hard permacrete of the street. My helmet was gone, and the air, the clean, cool, exhaust-tinged air of the city filled my lungs. It was the sweetest thing I had ever tasted. My body was a landscape of pain, but I was alive, and I was out. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up onto one elbow. My suit hung off me in charred, melted ribbons. My skin was a raw, red testament to the digestive fluids, a patchwork of chemical burns and bleeding wounds. But I could see it. The Arco 7 bio-tenement loomed over me, a wounded giant against the gray sky. It was dying. A great, gaping wound had been torn in its side, on the 112th floor. From it, the last of its internal fluids poured in a grotesque waterfall of blood and gore. The faint, rhythmic glow in its translucent skin was gone. The entire structure shuddered one last colossal time, a final death throe that sent a shower of debris raining down onto the street. Then it fell silent. The thousands of apartment lights, which were tied into its biological systems, flickered and died, one by one, until the entire monolithic structure was just a dark, dead shape against the clouds. Sirens wailed in the distance. People were screaming. I just lay there, on the broken pavement, gasping the free air, watching the great beast I had slain. I had won. The weeks that followed were a blur of sterile white rooms, the scent of antiseptic, and the muffled, calm voices of medical staff. They called my survival a miracle. I called it a damn nuisance. I was a patchwork quilt of other people's skin, my body a roadmap of grafts and synthetic flesh laid over the topography of chemical burns and deep lacerations. Moving was an exercise in agony. Sleeping was a journey into suffocating, dark tunnels filled with a relentless, wet shuffling. The debriefings were a joke. I told them what happened, and they wrote down a heavily redacted version. Catastrophic structural failure due to unforeseen biological cascade. They didn't want to hear about malignant neoplasms, phagocytic agents, or the building's coordinated immune response. It was bad for business. Bioarchitecture was still a trillion-credit industry. My official story was that I was a hero who survived a tragic accident. I felt more like a ghost. A persistent, rattling cough had taken root deep in my chest. The doctors said it was a side effect of the trauma, my lungs irritated by the internal atmosphere and fluids I'd inhaled. They gave me suppressants and expectorants, but nothing seemed to help. Every morning, I'd wake in a fit of hacking, bringing up a thick, stringy phlegm that was pearlescent and strangely organic. It wasn't the color of any normal sickness. I'd stare at it in the basin, a knot of unease tightening in my scarred gut. They were ready to discharge me. My physical wounds were healing, the new skin grafting to the old with surprising speed. A remarkable recovery. My primary physician, a woman named Eris, told me, her eyes flitting over a data pad. Your system seems to be hyper-regenerative. That morning, as I was going through the painful process of dressing myself, I paused in front of the mirror. The skin graft on my forearm, a large patch stretching from wrist to elbow, had always felt different. It was smoother than the rest, the color slightly off. Today, in the harsh light of the medbay, I saw something new. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the polished metal. Under the translucent surface of the new skin, faint and delicate as a spider's web, was a pattern. A web of tiny, dark blue-gray veins that didn't match my own circulatory system. They weren't supposed to be there. They weren't mine. They pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, completely out of sync with my own frantic heartbeat. It was a pattern I recognized, a miniaturized version of the capillary network that had lined the Arco 7. A wave of cold dread washed over me, more profound and terrifying than anything I'd felt inside the tenement. I tore my gaze from my arm and looked at my reflection. My eyes, sunken in my scarred face, looked alien to me. I took a deep, shuddering breath and was immediately racked by another coughing fit. It was worse this time, a deep, guttural hacking that bent me double. I coughed into my hand, and when I looked, it wasn't just the strange phlegm. It was a tiny, perfectly formed globule of milky white protoplasm. It quivered for a moment in my palm, then extended a single exploratory pseudopod. The building was dead. I had killed it. But as I stood there, staring at the microscopic phagocyte in my hand and the alien veins spreading beneath my skin, I finally understood the horrifying truth. An infection doesn't just kill its host. A successful infection finds a new one. It adapts. It survives. I hadn't just escaped. I was a piece of the building that had broken off and walked away. The monstrous architecture now lived and grew inside of me.